In this video, I'm not going to do a lot of research. I'm just going to answer a question that someone's been waiting for me to respond to for well over a month, and I'm just going to answer off the top of my head. It's not going to be extremely in-depth and thorough as much as I'd like it to be. Also, I still plan to make videos regarding the afterlife in the Jewish faith, but I want that video to have more research behind it than what I'm currently able to give off the top of my head. So without further ado, let's get into answering this guy's questions with regard to certain verses that people bring up in order to say that the Jewish faith requires one to be against the state of Israel, a view which I strongly disagree with. So let's get into it. Okay, so this is the link that the guy gave me, he wants me to respond to, and it's basically just a list of verses and a few passages from Talmudic literature. I want to say first of all that I do not like to answer these kinds of questions, not these questions specifically, but long lists of claims. It could be, regardless of the claim, that there are some valid points in any given list of claims. It could also be that they're all nonsense. It could be that some of the quotes are valid and some are invalid, some are misinterpreted, some are mistranslated. But if you send me a list of one claim after another, that is less likely to be responded to by me, simply because you can't do justice in a reasonable amount of time to such a long length of claims. It's better to go one step at a time, and after the individual's acknowledged the particular point, then move on to the next. But anyway, we're going to try to fly through this. We'll see how well that goes. Where in the Torah does it say Jews can't have a state? Can you give me reference in the Torah and Bible where it says that the Jews are in exile and are not allowed to have a state? Biblical verses foretelling that God will send the Jews into exile. Okay, so right off the bat, biblical verses foretelling that God will send the Jews into exile are not verses in the Torah, the Bible, which state that they're not allowed to have a state. That's two different points. Basically, I already read through all of these, and none of them mention anything about the any prerequisites for the Jewish people returning back to the land of Israel. Let's start with this one, okay? Leviticus 26:33. And if you do not listen to me and do not keep all these commandments, and I will scatter you among the nations and send the sword after you, and your land will be desolate and your cities destroyed. Okay, but that doesn't say that it's forbidden to return. It's talking about when they're rebellious, they will be kicked out. So if people return to the land of Israel in order to live according to their traditions, regardless of their interpretation of the tradition of the Torah, there are more liberal type of religious Jews. There are more European, Hasidic type. There are different streams of observant, Torah-observant Judaism, okay? Obviously, many people who were a part of the reestablishment of the state of Israel were also secular, okay? However, just because the state was established with the involvement of secular people does not mean that the recreation of that state is not allowed by the Torah. It also doesn't mean that every policy of that state is acceptable according to Torah. They're different matters. The question of whether or not a state's policies are acceptable and whether or not that state has a right to exist are two different issues. All right, next verse. Again, that first verse, nothing about forbidding returning. It's just talking about leaving. So, Deuteronomy 4, verse 25. I call to witness today, heaven and earth, that you will perish quickly from the land that you are crossing over the Jordan to possess. You will not stay long in it, and God will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number in the nations where God will lead you. Okay, again, nothing about coming back. No prohibition of a state. 11:16. Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be seduced, and you turn away and serve other gods, and bow to them. Then God will be angry at you, and he will close up the heavens, and there will be no rain, and the earth will not give its produce, and you will perish quickly from upon the good land that God gives you. Again, it doesn't give any prohibition about coming back. It's just a warning that if you don't heed the Torah, you are going to perish from the land, and you will be scattered, just like the previous verses. If anything, so far these verses are just reaffirming that the people of Israel do have a very, very ancient and thoroughly documented connection to the land of Israel. Next verse, Deuteronomy 28, verse 36. God will lead you and your king, whom you will appoint over you, to a nation you and your fathers did not know. Okay, so again, this doesn't say anything about being prohibited to come back to the land of Israel. Let's look real fast at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 36 to get a little bit of context. All right, so the verse that was just in that list where it says, he will take you and the king whom you have set over yourselves and bring you to a nation that you have not known, a nation that your fathers have not known, and there you will serve other gods, wood and stone. That's in the context of the people of Israel already having rebelled against the Torah. So it's not talking about their return. That is very clear from this context. So let's go back. Okay, continuing. In the same chapter, and you shall be moved off the good land, right, that we already read, but that's further along in the chapter, so let's see the context again, 63, verse 63. Verse 63 is talking about before getting kicked off. Following this, and you will be scattered among all the peoples from one end of the earth. All right, it's not talking about when you're coming back. And if someone gives any weight to these verses, then they must also acknowledge the fact that the people of Israel had no repose, they had no rest while they were in exile. In other words, it was hard as crap being in exile. All right, so that's all of those verses. Now, biblical verses saying that the Jewish people will be gathered in from exile only when the Messiah comes. All right, let's see this. Isaiah 11, verse 1 through 12. A royal scepter will emerge from the stock of Jesse, and a sapling will sprout from his roots. The Spirit of God will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of God. And it shall come to pass on that day that the Lord will once again acquire the rest of his people, and he will gather the dispersed of Israel, and the scattered of Judah he will gather from the four corners of the earth. Okay, so I really don't see the problem here, but this is a little bit in a better direction, more along the lines of coming back to the land of Israel. It doesn't say that the people of Israel are not allowed to come back to the Holy Land, it doesn't say they're not allowed to create a type of government of some sort before the Messiah comes. This, only when the Messiah comes, is not found here. Okay? It can very well be, according to this verse, without any contradiction, that even a small handful of the exiles of Israel returned to the land and set up a government, and they could even be there for 1,000 years without having the Messiah come. But then suddenly, after 1,000 years of that government having existed, then the Messiah comes and he spearheads the return of the remainder of the exiles back to the land of Israel. That's just a hypothetical. There could be all sorts of scenarios without there being any contradiction of this verse. People who are so adamant about one specific interpretation tend to read into the verses concepts which are simply not there. Ezekiel 37, verse 21 through 24. So says the Lord God, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from all the sides, and I will bring them to their land, and my servant David will be king over them. One shepherd will be for all of them. And of course, we have a space. I'm not sure what it says there. However, in both this verse in Ezekiel and the one in Isaiah, it's talking about an ingathering of the exiles, and clearly, even though the state of Israel exists, it's a fact, there is still an enormous exile of the people of Israel. There's an enormous diaspora of the Jewish people outside the land of Israel still. So again, there's no contradiction. And still, there is no prohibition here saying that if a minority come and they're fleeing persecution and they're fighting for their lives following the Holocaust and oppression from Muslim governments, that they're not allowed to come to the Holy Land and create some, even a minimalist, I personally am for minimal government, at least create some sort of minimalist government to protect themselves. It's simply not here. Sorry. Okay, Talmudic sources saying that Jews are forbidden to return from exile on their own and create a state. Okay, so again, I'm not verifying everything here to see how much of it is elaborated upon and how much of it is actually directly from the Talmud, but this is supposedly from Tractate Ketubot. All right, the biblical book of Song of Songs says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the deer of the field, not to arouse or awaken the love before it is desired. This oath occurs 3 times in the Song of Songs. The Talmud interprets, okay, so clearly the Talmud doesn't say the Talmud interprets, but let's read it anyway. The Talmud interprets this metaphorical language to mean as follows: the speaker here is God, the daughters of Jerusalem are the Jewish people and the nations of the world. During the exile, which began with the destruction of the temple in the year 69, God placed 3 oaths upon the world, 2 upon the Jewish people and 1 upon the nations. The Jewish people were forsworn not to immigrate as a wall in mass to the Holy Land and not to rebel against the other nations. The nations were forsworn not to afflict the Jews too much. Okay, so first of all, this is a gadata. This is a non-legal portion of the Talmudic literature, so it's not considered binding. Also, the vast majority of Jews, even the vast majority of traditional Jews, don't feel bound by every single statement in the Talmud. It is a falsehood promoted and spread by anti-Jewish individuals. A falsehood that all Jews hold the Talmud to be equal to and even above the Word of God, the Bible. That's complete nonsense. The vast majority of Jews don't consider there to be any authority in the Talmud. Among traditional Jews, there are varying levels of adherence to Talmudic law, and there is no stream of Judaism that considers everything in the Talmud to be binding. And even according to this teaching, supposedly from the Talmud, it's clearly the Talmud interprets this metaphorical language, as it says right here. It's clearly not a direct quote. But even according to what's here in front of us, well, the nations did break their own part of this oath. The nations did afflict the Jews too much, and the writings of the prophets in the Bible even state this. They even say that they oppressed the Jews, the people of Israel, more than was coming to the people of Israel, more than the Jewish people had coming to them. So, 1, the nations broke theirs, so the oath was already broken, and 2, when the state of Israel was reformed, Jews were essentially driven here by the Holocaust and by oppression and persecution in the Muslim world. And the opportunity to recreate the state was given to them by the nations. So when you have 2 parties of a contract make a deal, and then the same 2 parties agree to create some kind of a new condition, that's completely acceptable. So that doesn't work either. Midrash Rabbah, the reason for the oath against mass immigration is that if the Jews were to do it on their own, why would the Messiah have to come together in the exiles? The Messiah is not one single individual. The Messiah is simply a king or a high priest of Israel. The idea of one single Messiah is not a concept that can be found in the Torah, and it's not a concept that's even in Halakha. Halakha in the Talmud discusses a Messiah-type figure, but he would be one among many. He would have a dynasty that follows after him, and his function is much more than just gathering in the exiles. And again, the state of Israel has not gathered in the exiles, so there still remains plenty of work to be done. Next, Midrash Rabbah on 8:14, the redemption of the Jewish people is compared to the grain harvest, the grape harvest, the spice harvest, and the woman giving birth. The common thread of all these metaphors is that it can not be done too early. If grain is cut too early, it will not be good, even as animal feed. If grapes are cut too early, they will not be good even to make vinegar. If spices picked too early, it will not have a smell. It must be allowed to dry out on the tree. And if a woman gives birth prematurely, the baby will not live. So too, if the Jewish people hurries the end, they will not be successful, but at the proper time, may it be soon, they will be successful. Um, okay, well, we know now that even if a child is born a little bit premature, he can still survive in certain conditions, and sometimes even easily he can still survive if he's just a little bit early. Also, the state of Israel was not established with an intent to hurry the redemption along. The state of Israel was really formed, whether they were religious Jews, whether they were secular Jews, regardless of the type of Jews they were, the general push towards the reestablishment of an independent Jewish state was one of necessity, of life and death. They were basically coerced, and when the nations gave them the go, the nations themselves agree for them to do it, i.e. the UN, the empire, which was occupying the Holy Land at that time, that is the British Empire, then they went and did it. The point was not to bring about the end of the world or to create some kind of messianic era. Of course, observant Jews believe that there will eventually come such time period, but in their forming of the state of Israel, this was not with such an intent. Okay, the difference between the present era and the days of the Messiah is that in the present era, Jews are in exile under the nations. In the days of the Messiah, they will be independent. Okay, great. Well, even now, in the state of Israel, Jews are not completely independent. There are many things that go on here. I speak as someone who's lived here for nearly 15 years, who has plenty of criticism to give to the Jewish people, and I also have criticism to give to the Israeli government and Israeli society. I can also criticize pretty much any other culture and society on earth. Um, I'm someone who's very critical and objective, and I call a spade a spade. I don't think Israel is perfect. However, um, the majority of claims made against Israel I find completely ridiculous and unfounded. Um, and the state of Israel as it is today is not completely independent. That is my main point. If it were, there would be a lot of things different. There would be no terrorism. Those who support terrorists would be kicked out. Kicked out. No discussion, no negotiations. They would be kicked out, but they're not. Over 20% of Israel's citizenry, we're not talking about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, those living in internationally recognized Israel, over 20% are local Muslims and a small percentage of local Arab Christians, aka Palestinians of this area, quote unquote. And they are citizens living here, and many of them, even though they're citizens, hate Israel. Yet they're still citizens. If Israel was truly independent, they would be out of here. But they're not. Additionally, the Jewish people would have built the temple already. But we haven't. And despite propaganda in Islamic media, the vast majority of Israelis, even though the majority of them are slightly traditional, the vast majority, including the majority of religious Jews, are not pushing for a proactive building of the temple. The majority of extremely religious Jews believe that the temple will miraculously descend from the sky, and the majority of moderately religious and reasonable, rational type observant Jews and less observant Jews don't believe that we're ready to do this kind of thing, largely because of the way the world would react. In other words, Israel is not independent. Not independent in the sense to exercise its self-determination and its historical, cultural, and religious identity. Precedent. Other moments in history when Jews attempted to end exile in an unauthorized way. Well, you haven't yet proved that the previous passages are the only way. In fact, the previous passages don't tell you how. Halakha tells you how. You can find the way that that's described in the Talmud. You can find it listed in Mishneh Torah in Hilchot Melachim u'Milchomotehem. The Laws of Kings and Wars, the last book of the Mishneh Torah. There you will find the actual laws of Jewish law, how to do it, and it doesn't say what this claim is trying to say. Tribe of Ephraim. Okay, this is a lot of stuff. I'm going to have to put this into a second part. This is ridiculous. So I don't even really know why I'm replying to this. I've answered enough for now. Maybe I'll make a part 2, but I think the point has already been made. Hope you guys enjoyed this little rant. Let me know if you think this is a good format or not. And yeah, just give me some feedback. All the best. Bye for now. Shabbat Shalom.